This podcast episode reflects the opinions of the hosts and guests and not of Greenberg Traurig LLP. This episode is presented for informational purposes only, and it is not intended to be construed or used as general legal advice nor a solicitation of any type.
Hello, everybody. This is Michael Taylor and Adam Roseman of the global law firm Greenberg Traurig. Welcome to the next episode of the Workplace Safety Review podcast. I am the chair of the GT OSHA practice group and am based out of our Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia offices. My colleague Adam is a member of the GT OSHA practice group as well. He is a co-host, and he is based out of our Philadelphia office. To learn more about me, Adam, or our OSHA practice group, please feel free to go to www.gtlaw.com, where you'll find the information you're looking for. Our special guest today is Mr. Jess McCluer. Jess is the Vice President, Safety and Regulatory Affairs with the National Grain and Feed Association. Jess is responsible for directing and managing the NGFA's wide-ranging operation programs for grain elevators, feed mills, and grain processing plants. Jess also oversees the NGFA's activities regarding employee safety and industrial health, environmental issues, grain handling facility design and equipment, grain inspection and weighing issues, grain and feed quality and agro-terrorism, facility security-related issues. Jess also serves as the chairman of the board of directors for the Agricultural Safety and Health Council of America. Prior to joining NGFA in 2007, Jess was a program analyst at OSHA's Office of Outreach Services and Alliances. In 2001, Jess was awarded the Leader in the Field by the Journal of Agromedicine. The journal gave him the award, recognizing him for his significant contributions in agricultural safety and health practice, policy, and research. Welcome, Jess.
Well, hi, Michael. Nice to hear your voice.
Hey, nice to chat with you again. It's been a while. Lots been going on since you and I last spoke. I wanted to ask you about this award that you just received. Can you tell our audience a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in your podcast. Appreciate the introduction. Yeah, this award came as a surprise to me, and it primarily is my role as the chairman of the board for the Agricultural Safety and Health Council of America, and it's a great opportunity because it's a coalition of the agricultural business leaders, producer association, risk managers, and other groups, in addition to academia. And the purpose behind the organization is kind of a sharing of information between academia and research and those within agriculture. So by being involved in that and rising to the top, they said, we appreciate your service, especially during everything that we had to deal with last year during the pandemic. But I was quite impressed when I saw some of the previous recipients and, the Journal of Agromedicine. Obviously, that's the quarterly journal, and they come out with, just an update on a lot of the research that's going on in the field. But when I saw that the former Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa was one of the recipients, and I was also one, I was like, okay, well, I guess this is a pretty sufficient award. So I did appreciate that. And the one of the organizations that we work with through ASHCA, the Marshfield Research, and they're located in Wisconsin, and obviously they do a lot of work with youth ag safety, and so that's where, and they're really behind the journal as well.
Hey, Jess, I want to take you back, and we'll certainly get into your work for the National Grain and Feed Association, but before that, like we said in the opening, you worked for OSHA as a program analyst, and help our listeners understand, one, what did you do at OSHA? And I think most employers and listeners see OSHA as an enforcement as an enforcement agency, but it looks like you were with OSHA's Office of Outreach Services and Alliance. What is that, and what did you do for OSHA?
Sure. Well, I was a bureaucrat. No, just yeah. And actually, I had my chance to. For those outside the Beltway, I'm here inside the Beltway, so it was a great opportunity. Well, personally, thought it was a great opportunity to get experience working in the government, seeing how the whole process works, and by being a part of that, what that would mean. If I wanted to stay career, as a civil servant or go back to the private sector. So there's a great opportunity with OSHA because a previous job that I had working for a trade association, the Shipbuilders Council of America, we were one of the first organizations to sign an alliance with OSHA. And this was back in the 2002, 2003, and in the Bush 43 administration, they had created the program, and it was more focusing on the outreach part of it. So by being part of that, there was an opportunity to work for it, and I thought it was a great opportunity because it was a brand new program, a brand new department, and not oftentimes do you have that opportunity. So when I got in there, basically my job, however you want to describe it, an alliance coordinator was like an account executive. So I would be the one that would be coordinating with all these organizations that wanted to sign the alliance, and I'd be the one kind of directing traffic, so to speak. So at the time, we were having meetings nonstop, and I was coordinating over 30-something alliances. So I was working with National Association of Home Builders. I worked with the American Petroleum Institute and the National Fire Protection Association. So a lot of these larger trade groups within the area and groups that I had contacts with, I was the point person working with them. And it was very interesting to see how the whole program developed. And, obviously the Alliance program now is a lot different than it was when it started, but being there right there at the beginning and seeing how it all was processed and getting to know and work firsthand, with some of the senior leaders too was interesting as well, like Jonathan Snare, who used to be the acting administrator. I remember putting together all the talking points and being in there for the meetings. So anyway, that's
just to tell you, well, one follow-up, but just as that you mentioned John Snare, I actually worked with him as a younger lawyer and knew him quite well. But let me ask you this as just a follow-up, and then we'll go on to something else. How did you help build or convince those associations, to trust the federal agency, right? When I think their members, right, those trade associations members probably take a pretty they're probably pretty guarded when it comes to OSHA and the trust. So how do you build that trust to make that alliance a successful alliance, right?
That was quite a challenge. And I think that's where, like with everything else that we have to deal with when it comes into Washington and working with government agencies, and also a lot of that is personality and building that trust. Yeah. The challenge was with the program when it began is that trying to be the facilitator, so to speak, with the different departments, right? So trying to be a facilitator between construction, between standards, between enforcement, and that's how the program changed, because it used to be industry wanted OSHA to do everything, right? When I first started, it was like, hey, you, OSHA, developed the safety tip sheet, not us.
Right.
And then it flipped, and OSHA said, no. Because then the staff, with the manpower and everyone else were like, no, it's not going to work this way. And then trying to get through the politics, as you well know, if you worked with Jonathan and the solicitor's office, everything had to be finally approved. Going through all the steps, those on the outside were like, why is this taking so long? It's like, well, we got to run it through the chain. And I think that was part of the challenge, is everyone understanding how that whole process worked with the government, because they thought, well, if we get an alliance, right, well, we'll get it done. Well, not necessarily. And one other thing to add, too, that we found out while doing through that, there was a lot of those groups that just wanted it to do the photo op. They weren't really seriously behind the efforts to really work on developing and educating. I think that's really what a lot of the larger groups wanted to do, is they wanted to be involved in that education process with OSHA staff to make sure they had a clearer understanding of how the industry works, so they know what the real hazards are.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm sorry, Mike. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, and I think that's very crucial because, I've been representing clients in litigation against OSHA, if you will, for the last 18 so years. And one of the big problems that I've seen over the years is this lack of knowledge by the OSHA compliance officers of the business that they're actually inspecting. And I know a lot of my clients over the years would rather have an experienced or knowledgeable compliance officer do an inspection than someone that's never been into an oil refinery before, for example.
And that's a good point. And that's something, and as we get to it, and I can tell you coming into the grain industry too, that's a lot of the feelings. And, and I worked at OSHA, just like with a lot of the agencies, there are some very smart, talented, hardworking people. The challenge is there's, so many specific industries, right? You have so many industries that have a lot of vertical standards, right? And for those of you out there not quite familiar, you have your horizontal general industry standards. You're talking 1910 general industry, but you talk vertical like a 1910 272 for the grain handling industry, right? So you talk about that, and it's like there are very few that have that really specific. So if you're going to go in, just like as you well know, with process safety management and all of that, they may know construction, they may know general industry, but if they were to go into a facility, and what are the real true hazards, right? Is it the machine guarding, in 1, millimeter that we're familiar with? Is it a ladder? Are those the real hazards that, they should be aware of, or are those just checking the box, so to speak, so they can go back and just say, okay, well, this is a programmed inspection, I've done it, on to the next.
Right. That makes sense. Switching topics here for just a second, Jess. The elephant in the room, COVID-19, right?
Never heard of it.
I must say that Adam and I predicted that OSHA will never come out with a temporary COVID standard, and we're right so far, right?
Well, there's everyone's, it's the $64,000 question, right? What's going to happen next? And I think everyone has their own opinion. And I think, I have my personal opinion. I'll give you my personal opinion. This is in no way an official opinion on behalf of whom I work for. But,
right.
I think this is where the politics really comes into play here. And I think that, even though you look anywhere you look, you can look, see the numbers dropping. The numbers are dropping daily with the number of cases, number of fatalities. Everyone's saying, the pandemic's over, the masks. So how does this justify? Is this truly an emergency?
Emergency, right.
Is this truly an emergency to justify this? However, this was a huge political issue for labor, and labor was a very strong supporter of the current administration. They tried to get something passed in the previous Congress when the Republicans were in control of the Senate. They tried to get something passed in the House. They, had the lawsuit that they lost to the DC Circuit. So all of the political part comes in. They got to do something to appease, they being the administration, to appease labor. So what is that appeasement going to be is the question. From what I've heard is that, it may just be something to incentivize vaccination, right? Maybe incentivize vaccination in some way, or I've heard others, the other scuttlebutt is that it could be, a precursor to an infectious disease standard if they come out with some type of emergency standard, because the day, as I'm sure your firm is well aware, before the ink dries on the Federal Register notice, there's going to be, legal challenges filed, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And once those challenges are filed, can this, whatever standard this is, stand up in court? And that's
I think, Jess, you hit it on the head, which is it's going to be hard for an agency to say this is an emergency when another federal agency like the CDC says if you're fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear your mask outside or indoors. And the challenge, it's with each, Mike and I always joke, with each passing day, the argument of an emergency becomes less and less.
Exactly.
And that is really where the rubber meets the road with this. But to your point, it was a very hot political issue, right? And we didn't know what life was going to look like in May back in January when things were very different, right? And it's, so it's an interesting thing. And I think Mike and I took the minority view that it was going to be a tough road for the new administration. And I think so far we've we've been Nostradamus on this. This is a challenge.
You're exactly right. When you see that, from what I heard, as I understand, when the announcement came out at the end of April, that Secretary Walsh was reviewing it, is like the only reason it made public is because he was having calls with the labor groups, right? And that's how it made the news, because I think that's something you can see. And you're right, having the executive order, coming out the first day of the administration about this plan on public work safety. I mean, you can tell that's where the labor groups are having a very key role. But I don't know, it's how I get asked this by the members on a daily basis. And I said, the only answer I can give you on this issue is it's your own decision. That's really the only answer I can give you. I said, there's so many other rules that are out there, guidelines that, you all have to make that decision. So,
hey, Jess, putting the emergency standard off to the side for a minute, whether it happens and doesn't, which, like you said, is the $64,000 question. How, because you are in sort of a unique industry that maybe not all of our listeners are deeply familiar with. How has COVID impacted your members, right? And I know that's a broad question, but where have you sort of seen the biggest impact?
Yeah, it's been very interesting, just sort of the background. So the grain handling industry. So when you think of grain handling, right? So the National Grain Feed Association, this is our 125th year anniversary. We're talking grain elevators, feed mills, oilseed processing facilities, also milling, dry and wet corn and wheat milling, and also export. So it's a big part of the value chain within the ag industry. So when you think about all this, just think of a farmer, grain that he takes to a grain elevator, right? They store it, right, or they make it into the food. And it's been very interesting because, the one thing that everyone dealt with at the beginning is PPE. And PPE was critical. This is food and ag. We're a critical part of the sector, right? If you don't have grain, how are you going to have any, food products, right? Both human and animal. And so that's why the challenges that talking with many of the members were facing was just trying to, meet these local and state requirements. Those were the challenges, right? The good thing is within our industry, a lot of these facilities, newer facilities, are so much more automated. Not as many are working there in certain, I mean, it depends on the sector, and the facility, it can vary. But, the PPE area was the issue. I remember getting calls, how do they deal with inspections? You had an employee complaint about something, trying to deal with virtual inspections, which I'm sure you all know about. And then trying to keep the PPE supply was a huge issue. Some areas, I talked with members that had no problem. Others were like struggling to meet them. So how can you keep everything running if you don't have that? So those are the primary. We're very fortunate, I should say. You hear so many other stories like when the healthcare industry and some of these others, but they're in so many different locations, being in rural areas, and not working as closely with government agencies. Some of our export facilities, that was a challenge we had to deal with because they work with federal agencies on, inspection and, international type requirements. So those are some challenges I had to deal with there with government officials working there. But all in all, they didn't have as great of challenges as, say, other industries.
Understood. That makes sense.
Hey, Jess, during the Obama administration, there was a big push to conduct, I guess, as many inspections as possible, it seemed, in the grain industry, primarily focusing on combustible dust as well as guarding-related issues. Do you see the Biden administration picking up where the Obama administration left off in terms of the Grain and Feed Association work?
If I have to be, as you said, Nostradamus, my Nostradamus reading for our industry during this current administration is going to be a significant increase in inspections. And, within the grain feed industry, we are on the regional and local enforcement programs for regions 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10. I'm sorry, 8 and 10. So regions 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. We're on the REP and the LEPs, and those are 5 years, right, because of the memorandum they came out with. So they're going to be coming out and inspecting us. The areas, obviously, what we're really concerned about with this new administration is it's going to go backwards to the Obama administration, where It's going to be basically if they did a citation at a facility in Kansas and they got them for machine guarding, and then they do one at the same company in Nebraska, that's going to be a repeat violation, right? That's a big concern that we can see coming down the pipe. The issues for our industry are, grain bin entry, engulfment. Engulfment are very high profile. Oftentimes, a vast majority, 70% can occur on a farm. But the PR, guess what? OSHA doesn't have the authority to, inspect or cite a farm, so they'll increase inspection at commercial facilities. Combustible dust is a big issue for us. As you said, we're the only industry regulated by OSHA for dust, the grain handling standard. And as I mentioned offline, we submitted comments today on the proposed amendments to the HAZCOM standard where they want to define dust. So there's a lot of issues we see coming, and we try to be very proactive because guess what? We have an alliance with OSHA, NGFA, and the Grain Elevator and Processing Society and Grain Handling Safety Council. We all work together because we're trying to promote safety and show them the resources that we have and how important it is.
Another question I have is the grain handling standard was promulgated, in the mid-'80s, I think, right? What part of the grain handling standard do you think is broken and needs to be fixed? Yeah. Meaning if you had your magic pen and could rewrite it, are there anything that sticks out in your mind that you could say, hey, yeah, definitely?
Talking with members, the grain handling standard, there are some obviously parts of it that are a bit dated because of the change in technology, but overall the standard, it is specific for our industry. As far as the dust issue goes, it's perfect because that standard is specifically for our industry. It's not a one size fits all. And, I think that's the key issue right now with what we can see happening with a lot of agencies, OSHA, EPA and so forth. These standards they're trying to develop are not industry specific. And that's the real challenge because we don't want to be a subchapter and a general combustible dust standard where, combustible dust in an oil refinery is a lot different than combustible dust at a grain handling facility. So why should we be having to comply with these same requirements when it's totally different? So OSHA did a review. They did it actually hard to believe. You don't hear this very often, a Section 610 review of the grain handling standard. And if I recall, it was 95-ish. I'd have to double check, so don't quote me. It's not for the record. It around 95-ish, and they said, hey, this standard's doing fine. So you think about when OSHA developed it, and we worked with them very closely, did the research, NGFA being we, and it's a great example of industry and the agency working together. But as I said, my greatest fear moving forward is that these older standards, these industry specific, I can see them trying to be just, put together as kind of a subgroup of a larger chapter.
So was the grain handling standard a negotiated rulemaking?
Well, I don't know if it wasn't a neg-reg, as I understand. The negotiated rulemaking process is my understanding, when everything happened, there was a series of explosions in the late 70s, a very, catastrophic explosions at grain elevators. OSHA, pretty much, fairly new agency, then that's when they began working. And NGFA, we had many of our members contribute a large sum of to our Fire and Explosion Research Council to do a lot of the research, gather the information, and it was a lot of back and forth in trying to, come to, work together on developing. Like anything, there's a lot of public meetings. I'll throw a name out there, and this is all stories that I've heard. I wasn't in person, but you may know somebody named Debbie Berkowitz. Have you heard that name before?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Guess what? Guess she was representing a millers union that when, from the stories that I've heard, it's like when they had the public meetings, she would be there on behalf of the millers union, talking about how, they didn't think that the proposed rule was, stringent enough. Anyway, but it all worked out in the end, and that's why, like I said, being an industry specific, and I think many of it's done it, and you see the results have been significant. If you look at the reduction in the number of grain dust explosions and the number of fatalities and injuries, and we have data on our webpage. It's significantly decreased. It's been very effective.
So it does sound like just that if you had your wand, it would actually be more industry specific standards for other industries. That this is actually working quite well, which is interesting because I guess it gives your members it gives them a cheat sheet on compliance, right? You don't sort of have to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yep, exactly. But the real challenge of that, like I mentioned earlier, being a vertical standard, industry specific, is not a lot. There are very few OSHA inspectors that really have that type of knowledge. Yep. So that's kind of the double-edged sword, which is why we have programs like the Alliance to work with them to educate them more.
Hey, Jess, I want to ask you just one final question that kind of a new term that I think Mike and I haven't really encountered quite as much, and probably our listeners haven't. I know you do a lot of employee safety and health, but I saw that you're doing a bit of, facility security and agro-terrorism. And so what is agro-terrorism? I think we can sort of understand the term, but what does that mean, and what's your involvement in it?
So that kind of goes back, agro-terrorism, facility security, after 9/11, and there was a lot of, the concern of, what could be a potential terror threat on the industry. So, just as an example, as they call it, like intentional adulteration. What happened if somebody came to a grain handling facility and were to put ricin into, stored grain? What would the impact of that be? Or the same thing at a food manufacturing facility. That's what they call the adulteration, contaminating. So those are the type of things, facility security. You always have to, facility security, people don't think about it in rural areas. You need to keep it, limited access because people can climb to the top. Sometimes an elevator might be the tallest structure that could be out there. People, may have want to hurt themselves or hurt others. And so there's a lot of things from facility security wise you need to think about. So when you get into agro-terrorism part of it, that's where, is there, how could like food supplies or the supply chain be either contaminated or impacted or, from a resiliency standpoint, like what happens if like, the Mississippi River, all the bridges collapse and, the locks are broken and you can't move grain on a barge, right? What do you do to address those types of issues? And also, when you think about it too, if somebody were to contaminate, say a 500,000 bushel or a tank of grain, how much ricin would that take to have an impact on a lot of people, right? If you put a small amount, it's a lot different than if you were to go to, say, a buffet at a restaurant.
Hey, Jess, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been awesome. We really appreciate it. And whenever this pandemic is officially over, we should meet in D.C. and have a cup of coffee.
I agree. It's great talking to you. I appreciate the invitation and any time.
Thank you so much, Jess.
All right. Thank you.
There you have it. Jess McCluer of the National Grain and Feed Association. And stay tuned to the next episode of the Workplace Safety Review podcast.